In the outer lanes of the Orion Drift, where old trade roads twisted between broken moons and dead mining stations, most captains learned one simple rule very early. Never stop for a weak distress signal unless there was profit in it. Fuel was expensive, pirates were clever, and traps were common. That was why, when a damaged human cargo shuttle drifted between a sharp field of black ice asteroids, flashing a broken emergency beacon into the dark, ship after ship passed it without slowing down. The shuttle was small, ugly, and clearly dying. Its hull was torn on one side, one engine was gone, and the emergency lights blinked so weakly that they looked more like a candle than a call for help. Inside the broken ship, a young human named Gene sat alone in the pilot's seat with blood dried near his eyebrow, and one hand pressed against a failing control panel that barely answered him anymore. He had been running cargo for a station on the edge of civilized space when a sudden pirate raid had torn through the route. His escort ships had fled, his own shuttle had been clipped by a missile blast, and he had been forced to limp into the asteroid field to avoid being destroyed. He survived, but only barely. The life support was dropping. The power cells were nearly empty. The long-range comms were dead. All he had left was a weak distress beacon, and a hope so thin it felt foolish even to hold on to it. Hours passed, then more hours. On his screen, he saw shadows of ships moving at the edge of sensor range, and every time his heart lifted, every time he whispered, "Please," but each one kept going, vanishing back into the sea of stars. Some captains saw the signal and marked it as danger. Some saw a human in the old ship records and decided it was not worth the risk. Humans were still rare then, new to the greater galaxy, and many species considered them reckless, loud, too emotional, or simply too much trouble. Gene knew all of that. Still, he kept the signal alive as long as he could. By the time the emergency lights dimmed again, his voice was rough, his throat dry, and the cold inside the shuttle had begun to creep into his bones. He leaned back, closed his eyes for a moment, and thought maybe this was how it ended. Not in battle, not in glory, but quietly, in a cracked cargo seat, forgotten in a field of stone. Far away, aboard a medium-sized salvage ship called the Blue Lantern, Captain Bora was checking route charts when her sensor officer muttered that a distress ping had appeared off their path. Bora was a hard woman by trade standards, not cruel but practical, with years of deep space experience carved into every decision she made. Her crew depended on her, and she did not waste fuel for strangers. "Ignore it," said her engineer Day, a broad-shouldered man with a habit of expecting the worst from everything. Could be bait. On another nearby route, the courier Captain Hannah, who flew a narrow silver ship built more for speed than comfort, received the same signal and frowned at the damage report attached to it. "Human vessel," said her navigator Sora, raising an eyebrow. "Not our problem." And on a heavy freighter 2 sectors away, Captain Nari saw the weak pulse and shook her head with regret, already turning away because she carried medical supplies that had to reach a colony on time. In the drift, everyone had reasons. Everyone had duties. Everyone had learned to survive by hard choices. But fate, or maybe simple human stubbornness, had a strange way of testing those choices. Bora's ship continued on for 6 minutes before she told the pilot to stop. No one spoke at first. Day looked up from the console. "Captain." Bora stared at the screen, at the weak blinking mark fading in and out. "If it's a trap, we leave," she said. "If it's real, we take the risk once." Day groaned, but he turned the ship anyway. At nearly the same time, Hannah, who had already accelerated away, let out a sharp breath and cursed under it, then ordered Sora to swing around. "If Bora got the signal too, she might go," Hannah said. "And if she goes alone, she'll complain about it for years." Sora laughed despite himself and adjusted course. By pure chance, or maybe because decent people in a cruel galaxy often found one another, the Blue Lantern and Hannah's courier ship arrived near the broken shuttle within minutes of each other. The field was worse than it looked. Jagged ice rocks spun in unstable patterns, scraping past each other with enough force to rip open a hull. The shuttle itself was lodged between 2 drifting chunks, rotating slowly. "He's still alive," Day said after a scan. "Barely." Bora narrowed her eyes. "Get us closer." Hannah's voice crackled over comms. sharp and familiar. You always choose the worst rescue jobs, Bora. Bora almost smiled. You came anyway, only because I enjoy making better decisions after you make bad ones. Together they moved through the asteroid field with careful bursts of thrusters, while Sora monitored the drift patterns and Day cursed at every near miss. One rock scraped the Blue Lantern's outer shield hard enough to make alarms flash. Another passed so close to Hannah's ship that it spun slightly from the wake. Still, they pushed deeper until the broken shuttle finally filled the viewports. Its hull looked like paper wrapped around a coffin. No docking lock, Day said. We'll have to cut in. Bora didn't hesitate. She grabbed a rescue suit and moved for the airlock. On Hannah's ship, Sora was already sealing his own suit. You are not going alone, Hannah snapped over the channel. Good, Bora replied. You're slower than me. The two captains and Sora crossed the gap on tether lines, boots hitting the dead shuttle with hollow thuds. They cut through a warped side hatch, sparks lighting the darkness inside, and forced the metal open. The air that escaped was thin and freezing. Inside, they found Jean slumped in the pilot's seat, half conscious, one hand still resting on the distress panel as if he refused to let go even in his sleep. He looked young, too young for a route that dangerous, with dark hair stuck to his forehead and lips pale from the cold. His eyes opened weakly when the light from their suit lamps hit him. For a second he seemed confused, almost certain he was dreaming. Then he saw them clearly and managed the smallest, most disbelieving smile. You came, he whispered. Bora moved fast, checking his pulse, sealing a med patch on the cut above his brow. Don't talk. Jean let out a faint laugh that sounded like it hurt. I thought no one would. Sora began securing emergency clamps while Bora and Hannah lifted Jean carefully from the seat. He tried to stand on his own and nearly collapsed. Hannah caught him before he hit the deck. Easy, she said, and her tone softened in a way her crew rarely heard. You're not dead yet. They pulled him across the tether line, step by step, back to the Blue Lantern while Hannah's ship provided cover and sensor watch. Twice the asteroid drift shifted suddenly, forcing Day to fire side thrusters to keep them from being crushed. Once, a rock the size of a dropship smashed into the shuttle they had just left, splitting it open like dry fruit. Jean watched it break apart through his visor, and for a moment he looked at the remains of his ship with a hollow expression, as if the last thing tying him to his past had been erased in front of him. Once aboard the Blue Lantern, he was rushed to the med bay, wrapped in thermal blankets, given warm fluids, and treated for minor burns, bruising, and cold exposure. Day grumbled the entire time about wasted supplies, but he adjusted the life support settings himself and made sure the human's body temperature rose slowly and safely. Hannah and Sora stayed long enough to confirm the danger had passed, then joined Bora in the common room while Jean rested. He's lucky, Sora said. Another hour and he was gone. Bora folded her arms. Luck had nothing to do with it. Day snorted. No, bad judgment did. When Jean finally woke properly, he was weak but alert, sitting up in the med bay with a cup of hot broth in shaking hands. He thanked them once, then again, and then so many times that Day told him to stop before it became annoying. Jean apologized for that too, which made Hannah laugh for the first time that day. Over the next several hours, while the Blue Lantern towed what little remained of his cargo beacon and plotted a course to the nearest station, Jean spoke with them. He was a simple independent hauler, he said, though Bora noticed he asked smart questions and listened more than he talked. He told them about the pirate ambush, about the escorts that fled, about how he had tried to hide in the asteroid field and barely made it. He did not complain much. He did not curse his luck. He mostly seemed amazed that strangers had risked their ships for him. He thanked Bora. He thanked Hannah. He thanked Sora. He even thanked Day, who looked offended by the idea but secretly checked his vitals twice more after that. By the time they reached the outpost station at the edge of the drift, Jean could walk on his own, though slowly. The station was old and crowded, built from stacked metal rings and patched solar fins, but to Jean it looked like salvation itself. Bora helped arrange a temporary dock permit. Hannah transferred a little fuel credit to his account without telling him until after. Day handed over a small pack of spare tools, because human ships are built badly, and Sora gave him a fresh comm chip linked to safer trade channels. Jean stood on the docking platform with a worn bag over one shoulder and stared at the four of them as workers moved around in the background. He looked as if he wanted to say something bigger than thank you and could not find the right shape for it. In the end, he bowed his head slightly, a gesture that surprised them all, and said in a quiet, steady voice, "I will not forget this. Ever." Bora waved it off. "Just stay off bad routes." Hannah smirked. "And if you see pirates, run faster." Even Day gave a grunt that might have been approval. But Jean looked at each of them one by one, memorizing their faces as if carving them into his mind. Then he said the strange thing none of them would truly understand until years later. "One day," he told them, "if I ever call for help, I hope you will hear me again." For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then Hannah laughed lightly and shook her head. "That sounds dramatic." Sora smiled. "Very human." Bora, though, studied Jin's face and saw that he meant every word. There was no joke in him, no empty promise made by a grateful survivor. He was planting something invisible in that moment, something small and quiet, like a seed in cold ground. Bora gave him a short nod. "If we hear it," she said, "we'll answer." Jean smiled then, a real smile this time, tired but warm, and turned toward the station gates. None of them knew where he would go next. None of them guessed that the rescued young human would spend the coming years crossing forgotten systems, helping miners, traders, colonists, and drifters in ways large and small. To them, he was just one life saved in a dangerous place, one decent choice made on a hard day in the Orion Drift. But as Jean disappeared into the station crowd, carrying little more than a tool bag, a damaged jacket, and a promise, the captains watched him go with the strange feeling that they had not reached the end of something that day. Without realizing it, they had only witnessed the beginning. Years passed after the day Bora, Hannah, Day, and Sora pulled the young human from the broken shuttle in the Orion Drift, and like most things in deep space, the memory should have faded under the weight of cargo schedules, fuel prices, pirate warnings, and the endless miles of cold stars between one contract and the next, yet somehow it did not. Bora still commanded the Blue Lantern, though her hair had a little more silver at the temples and her ship had a few more scars along its hull from storms, smugglers, and one foolish customs patrol that had tried to inspect her cargo during a solar flare. Day was still at her side, still grumbling about engines, still acting as if every living thing in the galaxy was personally designed to make his life harder, though his hands were as steady as ever and his repairs still kept the Blue Lantern alive in places where newer ships would have died. Hannah's courier vessel had changed twice over the years, each one faster than the last, because she hated being late more than she hated most people, and Sora, who once sat quietly beside her as navigator, had become something more like a partner, a man who could read routes and danger the way other people read simple words. Nari, the freighter captain who had once ignored the distress call because she was racing medicine to a colony, heard the story later at a station bar and carried it with her too, though she had never met the human herself. In the great map of the galaxy, they were still small people, independent captains without empires, admirals, or war fleets, but in the drifting roads between systems, where reputation mattered more than rank, their names had grown known. What none of them understood at first was that another name was also spreading quietly through the same dark roads, moving from station to station, from mining rig to refueling dock, from hidden colony to forgotten outpost, and that name was Jean. At first, the stories were so small they sounded like ordinary luck. A mining crew trapped in a tunnel collapse on a moon in the Hara Belt said a human freighter captain named Jean had stayed 3 extra days to help dig them out, even though his contract paid him nothing for the delay. A frozen farming colony near the Vesta Reach claimed that when their heating grid failed in the middle of a long eclipse, a passing human engineer had patched their system using parts from his own ship and refused payment, asking only for a hot meal and a place to sleep for one night. A broken patrol drone station on the edge of pirate space survived because a lone human cargo pilot carried spare comm relays and knew how to make dead circuits talk again. A smuggler with a half-burned face told a mechanic in a dockside repair bay that a human had once dragged him out of a burning escape pod after a raid, and then lied to the local authorities so he could disappear before bounty hunters arrived. Each story sounded different, but the name repeated often enough that people began to notice. Jean. Always Jean. Sometimes he was called lucky, sometimes foolish, sometimes too kind for his own good. But almost always, the people telling the stories smiled when they spoke his name, even the hard ones who did not smile much. Bora heard the first of those stories in a cargo exchange 2 years after the rescue, when a fuel broker mentioned a human who had talked down a panicked dock worker during a reactor leak and then personally helped evacuate half a station ring. Bora had not thought much of it until the broker mentioned the name. Jean, he had said, tapping numbers into a ledger. Strange man. Helps everyone. Bora looked up sharply. Dark hair? Talks too politely when he should be resting. The broker blinked. You know him? Bora only shrugged, but later that night, she stood in the Blue Lantern's quiet corridor and remembered the thin young man in the med bay, wrapped in blankets, looking at strangers like they had pulled him back from the grave. Day noticed her mood and snorted. If you're thinking about the human, stop. He's alive. That's enough. Bora gave him a flat look. You checked his transponder records too, didn't you? Day pretended not to hear. Hannah heard about Jean in a far stranger way. She was docked at a relay station near the shattered rings of Yul. 9 when a customs inspector she hated more than bad weather let her go without a fine after learning she once flew with Captain Jean through a storm corridor. Hannah immediately denied it. I did not fly with him, she said. I rescued him once because Bora made a bad decision. The inspector laughed. Then you know the one I mean. He guided 3 civilian ships through the corridor last cycle when their NAV systems failed. Saved them all. Hannah said nothing, but later she found herself asking around. The answers were always the same. Jean had become a wanderer of the outer lanes, taking rough contracts, short-haul freight, medical deliveries, rescue jobs, survey runs, and any work that let him move from place to place. He did not stay long anywhere, but when trouble came, he always seemed to be nearby. A broken lock, a pirate scare, a failing water filter, a lost child on a station, a wounded pilot, a drifting cargo pod, a damaged beacon, a starving colony. Somehow, he kept stepping into the middle of other people's bad days and leaving them better than he found them. Sora once joked that the human was collecting debts from the whole galaxy one good deed at a time. Hannah told him that sounded ridiculous. Secretly, she wondered if it was true. Time moved on. Ships changed. Routes shifted. Small wars flared and ended in distant sectors. Human space, once a cluster of uncertain systems at the edge of civilized charts, began to grow. Humans were still not the strongest species, nor the richest, nor the most advanced, but they were becoming known for something the older races found both annoying and unsettling. They went places they should not go. They settled hard worlds. They explored unstable routes. They built outposts where sensible species saw only risk. They made friends in ugly places and enemies in worse ones. And among those humans, Jean remained an odd name spoken with unusual respect by non-humans who normally trusted no one. Nari finally met him 5 years after the Orion Drift incident, though he did not know who she was. Her freighter, the Morning Veil, had suffered a magnetic coil failure in a dust lane where sensors became almost useless. She was carrying emergency grain for a famine-hit moon, and every lost hour mattered. Most ships avoided her distress ping because the lane was unstable, but a lean, battered human vessel answered. Jean came aboard with a tool case, a tired smile, and grease on his sleeve, studied her failing system for less than 10 minutes, then crawled into a maintenance shaft so narrow even Nari's smaller crew members hated it. 3 hours later, the coils were stable enough to finish the route. Nari offered him half her emergency bonus. He refused it. Use it for the colony, he said. They need it more. Only when he was preparing to leave did she notice an old patch sewn inside his jacket collar, a faded repair cloth marked with the symbol of the Blue Lantern's supply deck. Bora had given him that patch years ago after his original coat tore during treatment. Where did you get that? Nari asked. Jean touched it, surprised. Old friends, he said softly. Good people. Nari watched him go and felt, for the first time, a strange guilt for the distress signal she once ignored. Still, even as Jin's name traveled farther, no one guessed the shape of what he was truly building. It was not a fleet, not an army, not a network in the official sense. It was something older and harder to measure. Every miner he helped remembered his face. Every pilot he guided through danger remembered his voice. Every captain whose cargo he saved. Every station worker he treated kindly. Every colony he assisted. Every child he made laugh while repairing a broken water recycler. Every drifter he fed when they had nothing left. Each one carried a memory of him. In a galaxy built on contracts, profit, and suspicion, Gene left behind something far more powerful. Trust. It spread in quiet ways. A docking clerk in one system would waive a fee for a ship that carried Jin's code. A mechanic in another would move his repairs to the front of the line. A patrol officer in a third would look the other way when Gene took a route that technically needed clearance. When people asked why, the answers were simple. He helped my brother. He saved our station. He got medicine to us in winter. He stayed when others left. Bora saw more and more of it as years rolled on. Once, while unloading salvage at a ring station, she heard two rough-looking traders nearly start a fight over docking priority, until one of them noticed a cargo crate marked with an old human shipping code tied to Gene. The trader backed down at once. "If that's Jin's freight, let it pass," he said. "He helped my daughter." Bora stared for a long second. Day muttered, "This is getting weird." Bora did not disagree. Then, one cold cycle on the edge of the Talon expanse, Bora received a message burst while refueling. It was short, badly compressed, and routed through 6 outdated relay points. She almost deleted it, thinking it was junk, until she saw the sender tag. Gene. The message itself was simple. No emergency. No warning. Just a brief note. Still flying. Hope you are all well. I did not forget. Attached was a transfer of fuel credits. Far more than the supplies they had once spent on him. Bora stared at the amount in silence. Day looked over her shoulder and grunted. Took him long enough. But Bora could hear the warmth under his usual rough tone. Hannah got the same message a week later while outrunning an ion storm. She laughed aloud when she saw it. "He really kept his word," she said. Sora smiled. "Told you humans are dramatic." Nari received no money, but she got a different note after their Dust Lane encounter. One thanking her for trusting a stranger with her ship and ending with a line that stayed with her for months. A kind choice can arrive late and still matter. After that, the years seemed to bend faster. Rumors of unrest grew in the outer sectors. A hardline expansion fleet from an older alien coalition had begun pressing into weak border systems, claiming trade rights, security taxes, and eventually territory. Small colonies disappeared from public maps. Independent captains were searched more often. Routes once considered merely dangerous became nearly impossible without escorts. Bora hated the change. Hannah hated it more. Jin's name appeared less often in casual station gossip, not because he was gone, but because the places he traveled had become rougher, farther, and more secretive. Some said he had started running supplies to frontier human colonies that the larger powers wanted to pressure. Some said he had been seen near dead systems no sane pilot entered. Some said he was working with settlers building a new line of hidden outposts beyond normal charts. No one knew for sure. Then came the day the galaxy changed. It began without warning, in the middle of ordinary work. Bora was negotiating a salvage pickup. Hannah was 3 jumps from a courier deadline. Nari was overseeing cargo seals on the Morning Veil. Day was elbow-deep inside a fusion manifold. Sora was asleep in a chair with a NAV chart across his chest. Across thousands of systems on old radios, trade relays, mining towers, smugglers' bands, emergency channels, outdated freight frequencies, and forgotten civilian networks that modern military ships barely monitored anymore, a signal suddenly appeared. It was weak in some places, clear in others, but always the same. It carried an old identification code. Patched, scarred, and unmistakable to anyone who had once known it. A battered human transponder from years ago, the kind attached to a nearly dead shuttle in the Orion Drift. Then came the voice, older now, rougher, steady even through static, and every captain who heard it froze for one impossible second because they knew exactly who it was. "This is Gene," the message said. There was a brief pause, as if the stars themselves were holding their breath. Then the final words came, simple and quiet and far more powerful than any battle alarm. I need help. And in that moment, in cargo bays and bridge decks and station bars and repair docks across the galaxy, people who had not spoken his name in months or years lifted their heads all at once, because the human who had once helped everyone had finally made the call he promised long ago, and the sound of it was only beginning to spread. The moment Jin's voice spread across the old channels of the galaxy, it did something no military order, trade law, or royal command had ever managed to do. It made thousands of people stop what they were doing and listen. On the Blue Lantern, Bora stood frozen beside the comm panel while the short message played a second time through static, and for a brief second she was no longer an older salvage captain with tired eyes and a scarred ship, but the woman in the Orion Drift watching a half-dead human smile through pain because someone had chosen not to leave him behind. Day climbed halfway out of the fusion manifold, grease on his hands and anger already in his voice, but the second he heard the old transponder code he went silent. That's him, he said, as if saying it aloud made the years between then and now collapse into nothing. Bora's jaw tightened. Trace it. Day moved at once, fingers flying across cracked controls. Signal is bouncing through old freight relays, mining towers, civilian emergency repeaters. He set this up in layers. Smart. Bora felt a hard knot form in her chest. Jean had not sent a normal distress signal. He had built a web, a chain of old systems that military scanners ignored and independent captains still used. It was the kind of network only someone who had spent years traveling the forgotten roads would know how to touch. On Hannah's courier ship, the message hit while she was racing a narrow gravity fold between two unstable moons. Sora nearly dropped the NAV slate when Jin's voice filled the cockpit. Hannah reacted before the message even finished. She cut speed, ignoring the protest alarms, and turned to Sora with sharp eyes. Tell me that was real. Sora replayed it, and the moment the old code flashed across the display, his face changed. It's him. Hannah did not hesitate. She slapped the comm controls open and broadcast on every local captain band she had access to. This is Captain Hannah of the Swift Echo. If anyone else just got that signal, confirm now. For half a breath there was nothing. Then replies began coming in so fast the panel struggled to sort them. A miner out of the Juno belt. A hauler from the outer lanes. A courier she had raced 3 years earlier. A patrol pilot she disliked. A smuggler from a bad station near pirate space. One after another, voices cut in with the same stunned answer. Confirmed. Heard it too. That was Jean. I know that code. Hannah stared at the growing flood of responses and whispered, almost to herself, "What did you do, human?" Across the galaxy, the same scene repeated in different forms. Nari was supervising cargo seals when the message burst through an old civilian receiver her crew used only for backup. The moment she heard Jin's voice, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with station air. Her first officer looked up in confusion. "Captain." Nari turned so fast that workers stepped out of her way. "Delay loading. Warm the engines. Now. We're carrying relief grain," the officer protested. "If we miss the... warm the engines," Nari repeated, and something in her tone ended all argument. In a dockside repair bay on a forgotten station, a mechanic named Mina dropped her tools because she recognized the name at once. Years ago, Jean had helped keep her family's oxygen scrubbers running during a winter outage. On a survey ship near a dead star, Captain Yuri heard the call and remembered the human who once guided his crew through an ion storm after their systems failed. On a patrol craft assigned to a boring customs route, Officer Oon stared at the signal in disbelief because Jean had once smuggled medicine to her sick brother while pretending it was machine lubricant to avoid station taxes. On a rough cargo barge crewed by people who trusted no one, 3 deckhands looked at each other when the message ended and all said the same word at once. Jean. What made the moment truly strange was not that many knew him. It was how many. The replies started as ripples, then became waves. Old trade channels that were usually quiet exploded with voices. Some asked where he was. Some asked if anyone had a trace. Some simply said they were moving already. Bora watched the traffic build and realized this was no normal emergency. Independent captains were some of the hardest people in the galaxy to unite. They argued, lied, cheated, raced each other for contracts, and guarded fuel like it was blood. Yet now, because one human had spoken 5 simple words, ships were changing course everywhere. Day finally slammed a palm against the console. "I've got partial coordinates." Bora leaned in. "Where?" He looked at the data twice, then frowned. "That can't be right." "Say it." "Outer border beyond the Kalen Reach. Past the old colony line. Near the Ashen Veil systems." Bora felt her stomach sink. The Ashen Veil was a region most sane captains avoided. Sparse stars, dust clouds, weak relays, hidden gravity wells. Worse, it sat near disputed territory where a powerful coalition fleet had been pressuring small settlements and trade routes for the past 2 years. "He's in bad space," Day muttered. "Very bad." Bora didn't answer. She was already moving. Prep jump calculations. Full fuel priority. Dump the low-value salvage if we need speed. Day blinked. "That load is worth." Bora gave him a look. "Did I ask?" He grunted and got to work. On the Swift Echo, Hannah and Sora were already 3 steps ahead. Sora pulled every scrap of routing data he could from the signal path while Hannah opened a broadband captain channel and did something she almost never did. She asked for help. "This is Hannah. I have partial trace on Jin's signal. Ashen Veil approach Outer Kalen Reach. Anyone closer, report. Anyone with fuel or escort capability, move if you can. Spread the route." Her words shot outward through the same old network Jin had awakened, and the answers kept coming. Captain Era of a tanker ship said she could divert and bring extra fuel reserves. Captain Jisoo, who ran a small escort corvette, reported pirate activity near the second jump lane but said she was going anyway. A heavy hauler named Hyun said he could carry civilians if evacuation became necessary. A medical transport under Captain Somi began loading emergency kits before anyone even knew what the real problem was. Hannah listened, stunned. This was not a fleet. It was not organized. It was not efficient. It was something stranger and somehow stronger. A living memory turning into motion. News of the call moved faster than official channels could control. At stations where independent crews gathered, people began repeating the same phrases. The human called. Jin needs help. Signal came through the old bands. Even captains who had never met him directly often knew someone who had. A fuel seller remembered how Jin once repaired a leaking seal to prevent an explosion. A miner remembered a supply drop during a cave-in. A dock nurse remembered him carrying patients when gravity failed. One old smuggler in a cracked exosuit heard the message and laughed with wet eyes. "About time," he said, and started for his ship. As more ships moved, official authorities began noticing the traffic. Coalition patrol scanners picked up unusual civilian route shifts. Customs relays reported cargo vessels breaking contracts. Local defense nets flagged a surge of unscheduled jump signatures aimed toward the border sectors. Some officers tried to order them back. Most were ignored. Others demanded to know why dozens, then hundreds, then eventually thousands of independent ships were suddenly redirecting toward a dangerous frontier zone. No one could quite explain it in terms their systems understood. There was no central command, no military order, no profit incentive that made sense. There was only a name. Bora's Blue Lantern cleared dock ahead of schedule, engines roaring harder than Day liked. As the ship turned toward the first jump lane, a comm request flashed from an unfamiliar vessel. Bora accepted it and found herself staring at a broad-faced woman with oil stains on her collar. "Captain Mina," the stranger said quickly. "Repair barge Red Finch. Jean saved my family once. I can't fight, but I've got spare parts, shield mesh, and portable reactors. I'm falling in behind you." Before Bora could answer, another signal cut in. "Captain Yuri, survey ship North Glass. I have deep-range scans of the Ashen Veil approaches. Sending route data now." Then another. "Captain Un, patrol craft Iron Bell. No coalition checkpoint patterns. I can guide around their sweeps." Day looked over from engineering and gave a low whistle. "We are collecting strays." Bora's mouth twitched. Good. Let them come. Hours later, while ships crossed jump points and spread the call farther, the first real clue about Jin's situation arrived. It came from a half-damaged beacon buoy in a border system. One gene had apparently set to auto-release if his main call was received. The message was fragmentary, cut by interference, but enough got through to freeze every captain who heard it. Jin's older voice, strained but controlled, explained that a human frontier colony in the Ashenvale, one not officially listed on most public star maps, had been discovered by a coalition expansion fleet. The colony was small, mostly families, engineers, miners, and children building a long-term settlement on a harsh but resource-rich world. The coalition wanted the system, its mineral belt, and its jump position. They had issued a surrender demand and then cut off normal comms. Jin had been in the system delivering supplies when the blockade began. He could have left early. Instead, he stayed. He helped reinforce shields, organize shelters, reroute power, and set up old civilian transmitters beyond the blockade net. The message ended with a line that hit Bora like a hammer. I'm holding them as long as I can, but they will come down soon. If this reaches anyone, protect the colony. Silence filled the blue lantern after the message ended. Even Day, who always had something sharp to say, just stared at the dead comm panel. Bora felt something cold and fierce settle inside her. He stayed, she said quietly. Of course he stayed. Hannah received the same fragment moments later, and for once her usual sharp humor vanished completely. She looked at Sora, and he already knew what she was thinking. He's doing what he always does, Sora said. Helping people who can't run. Hannah tightened her harness. Then we make sure he doesn't do it alone. By now, the scale of the response was becoming impossible to ignore. Small convoys formed naturally along major routes. Tankers linked up with escorts. Medical ships paired with cargo haulers. Salvage vessels, survey craft, mining rigs with engines barely fit for deep travel, retired patrol ships, courier darts, freighters, smugglers, tugs, and even a few old war relics long since stripped of official colors all turned toward the same destination. Some captains knew each other. Most did not. Yet they shared coordinates, fuel data, hazard warnings, and jump windows with surprising discipline. Because every delay could mean the end of a colony and the death of the human who had once shown up on all their worst days. In station bars and bridge decks, one phrase began repeating so often it became almost like prayer. Hold on, Jean. We're coming. The coalition, meanwhile, remained blind to the emotional storm rushing toward them. Their fleet in the Ashenvale believed they faced an isolated frontier colony with little defense, a hidden human settlement too small to matter beyond its resources. They saw no great navy massing, no formal alliance mobilizing, no empire declaring war. They did not understand that the most dangerous force in the outer lanes was not a government at all, but gratitude carried in the hearts of thousands of stubborn captains who owed one human a debt they had never been allowed to repay. And as Bora's ship jumped through the dark, as Hannah's courier carved impossible speed across collapsing routes, as Nari's heavy freighter thundered after them with relief supplies and hardened resolve, as more and more ships joined the growing river of steel and fire crossing the stars, the truth became clear to everyone listening on the old channels. Jin's call had not just reached the captains who once saved him. It had reached every life he had touched, every family he had helped, every stranger he had treated like they mattered, and the galaxy itself was beginning to answer to be why the time the first ships reached the edge of the Ashen Vale, the hidden human colony below had already been pushed to the edge of collapse, and the people on the surface knew it. The world was called Haven 47, though there was very little about it that felt gentle now. It was a harsh frontier planet of red stone plains, deep iron mountains, and long black forests that shivered under constant cold winds. Years earlier, human settlers had come there quietly because the world held rare minerals, clean underground water, and a stable jump position near several forgotten trade paths. It was the kind of place large powers ignored until it suddenly became valuable. Now a coalition expansion fleet hung in orbit like a dark storm, dozens of warships and support carriers forming a heavy ring around the planet, while smaller assault craft moved in patrol lines above the atmosphere. Their leader, Commander Reth, had sent the same message 3 times over the last day. surrender the colony, hand over its mining rights, and accept permanent military occupation. The settlers had refused, not because they believed they could win, but because they knew what occupation meant in border space. It meant forced labor contracts, broken families, seized ships, and the slow death of freedom under polite words and armed supervision. Down in the colony's central control hub, emergency lights washed the metal walls in red as technicians rushed from console to console trying to keep failing systems alive. Shield strength was dropping. Surface cannons were overheating. Power reserves were draining too fast. The colony had only a few defensive guns, some old mining lasers repurposed into orbital weapons, and a handful of rugged shuttles that were never meant for war. At the center of it all stood Gene, older now, broader in the shoulders, with new scars on his hands and face and the calm eyes of a man who had spent years solving other people's disasters before facing his own. His jacket was torn, one sleeve burned at the cuff, and there was dried blood near his temple from a near miss during the last bombardment. But he moved with steady purpose, checking reports, rerouting power, and speaking to frightened settlers in the same calm tone he had once used in failing stations and damaged freighters across the galaxy. Around him worked a small command group of colony leaders. Mira, the chief engineer with dark circles under her eyes and grease across her cheek. June, a former survey captain now responsible for defense coordination. Senna, the medic who had not slept in nearly 2 days. And Tay, a young communications tech whose hands shook each time the orbital guns fired. Shield grid at 28%, Mira said, her voice tight. If they hit the north emitters again, we lose the whole upper arc. Then shift everything we can from Sector 3, Jean answered. The hydrodomes can survive low heat for another hour. Another hour, Mira muttered, but she obeyed. June looked up from tactical displays. Their assault. Dropships are forming again. Jean stepped to the main screen and watched the enemy icons gather in orbit. They're testing us. They want us tired before they land in force. Tay swallowed hard. The old relays are still transmitting, but I don't know if anyone heard the call. That was the truth hanging over all of them. Jean had done everything he could with what little he had. When the coalition ships cut the main comnet, he had led a team through a freezing canyon at night to reach a buried civilian repeater left from an abandoned mining survey. When that repeater failed, he had stripped parts from his own ship, the battered freighter Wayfarer, and from 3 dead cargo shuttles to build a crude long-range signal chain. He had routed the distress call through old freight codes, obsolete civilian channels, and forgotten relay bands only independent captains still listened to. He had sent one short message, the same promise returned after all these years. This is Jean. I need help. But deep inside, even he did not know if it had worked. He hoped. He believed. Yet as the hours dragged on and the enemy fleet tightened its grip, hope became something painful to hold. On the surface, the colony shook under another orbital strike. A shield emitter on the eastern ridge exploded in a pillar of blue-white fire. The room trembled. Tay nearly fell from his chair. Senna caught him by the arm and pushed him back toward his station. Stay with me, she said firmly. Jean touched the edge of the tactical table, steadying himself as alarms screamed. Status. Eastern ridge gone, June snapped. We're open on that side. Then they'll try a landing corridor there. Jean looked at him. Can we still fire the old mining array? June grimaced. Only once, maybe twice, and then it burns out. Save it for when they commit. Mira stared at Jean as if he were asking the impossible. You're talking like we can stop a landing wave. Jean met her eyes. No, he said honestly. I'm talking like we can make it expensive enough to buy time. That was all he had been doing for the last day, buying time. Time for the civilians to move into deep shelters. Time for children to be transported into reinforced tunnel sections. Time for the hydro teams to preserve food stores. Time for the emergency med bays to fill and reorganize. Time for the signal to travel farther. Time for the impossible to maybe happen. Outside, through the high reinforced viewports, black shapes moved against the stars. Coalition attack craft were descending now, falling through the upper atmosphere in disciplined formation. June's face hardened. They're coming. Jean grabbed a headset and keyed the colony-wide emergency channel. His voice rolled through every shelter, maintenance shaft, and bunker on Haven 47. This is Jean. All civilians remain in protected sectors. Defense teams hold your positions. Do not break formation. We knew this might happen and we are still here. We are still standing. Hold the line. He ended the message before emotion could crack it. Senna looked at him with tired, red-rimmed eyes. You make that sound easy. Jean gave a small, humorless smile. It never is. High above the planet, Commander Reth stood on the bridge of the Coalition cruiser Dominion Spear, watching the tactical display with cold satisfaction. The human colony had resisted longer than expected, but resistance by weak settlements was common. It always broke in the end. Their outer shield arc is failing, his weapons officer reported. Surface batteries are reduced to minor threat. Reth folded his hands behind his back. Prepare full landing wave. Secure command centers first. Avoid unnecessary bombardment of the mineral zones. He did not care about the colonists except as labor and leverage. The system itself mattered. Its jump line, its ore belts, its location between trade shadows, those were the prizes. No unusual traffic? He asked. The sensor chief shook her head. Scattered background signatures in surrounding systems. Civilian class. No organized military threat. Reth gave a dismissive nod. That was the mistake. The first arrivals were too small to trigger alarm. Far out beyond the formal scan perimeter, a single courier vessel dropped from jump between dust veils and broken moons. It was Hannah's Swift Echo, running hot and dangerous after pushing its engines beyond safe limits for 2 straight days. Sora, pale from exhaustion, looked at the crowded sensor map and whispered, "We made it." Hannah stared at the blockade and swore under her breath. The coalition fleet was larger than she had feared. War cruisers, escort frigates, carrier support, drone screens. "No way we punch through alone," she said. "Good thing we're not alone," Sora answered. Almost as if the stars were listening, new signatures began blooming across the outer dark. 1, then 3, then 12, then more. The Blue Lantern arrived first among the larger ships, its old hull shaking as it tore out of jump. Bora stood on the bridge with both hands braced against the command rail. "There she is," Day said, pointing to the planet below. "And that blockade is ugly." Bora's eyes narrowed. "Open Captain Band. All frequencies." The moment the channel opened, voices flooded in. "Captain Era on Vector 7. Jisu in from the North Lane. Hyun Heavy Hauler approaching with shielded cargo pods. Somi Medical Transport holding back for evac. Mina Repair Barge with portable reactors. Yuri transmitting terrain scans. Un marking patrol blind spots." More and more followed. A growing storm of names, ships, and lives crossing into the same space. Nari's morning veil emerged with her freighter group behind her. Cargo containers stripped off to lighten mass. Emergency supplies locked down in the hold. She took one look at the blockade and felt her throat tighten. "That fool stayed," she whispered, though there was fierce respect in the words. The coalition sensors finally noticed. On the Dominion Spear, alarms began chiming as more civilian jump signatures appeared outside the perimeter. Reth frowned. "What is this?" The sensor chief hesitated. "Unscheduled arrivals, sir. Civilian vessels. Multiple origins." "How many?" She stared at the growing count, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. "It keeps increasing." Reth stepped closer. The display was filling with markers, small at first, then spreading in every direction like sparks in dry grass. Cargo haulers, couriers, salvage ships, tugs, mining rigs with retrofitted drives, patrol craft, survey ships, tankers, smugglers, old transports, civilian hulls of every class, age and shape, arriving in scattered clusters that somehow still felt united. "This is impossible," one officer whispered. Reth's voice sharpened. "Signal them away. Declare restricted military space." The warnings went out. Most of the arriving ships ignored them. Some laughed. Some responded with open insults. Some transmitted nothing at all and simply kept coming. On the colony surface, Tay suddenly jerked upright at his console. Wait, wait! His voice cracked with shock. I'm getting transponder blooms. Dozens? No, hundreds. June rushed to his station. From where? Everywhere. Tay's shaking hands flew over the controls. Outer perimeter. Dust lanes. High orbit shadows. There are too many. Mira looked at Jean. What is that? For the first time in nearly 2 days, Jin's face lost its careful control. He stared at the rising signals on the tactical display as if he could not quite believe his own eyes. Then one familiar code lit bright among the chaos. The Blue Lantern. Another followed. Swift Echo. Then Morning Veil. Then more names, more ships, more voices, more impossible proof. Tay switched the captain band to main audio, and the control hub filled with overlapping transmissions from the stars. Bora to Haven 47. Do you copy? Hannah here, human. You better still be alive. Nari on approach with supplies. Jisu ready for escort runs. Somi standing by for casualties. Mina has repair drones. Yuri marking shield gaps. Era bringing fuel. Hyun has evac pods. The room went silent except for the flood of voices. Mira covered her mouth. Senna's eyes filled with tears she did not have time to shed. June stared at the tactical screen as civilian signatures multiplied beyond count. Jean closed his eyes for one brief second, a man who had carried too much alone finally feeling the weight shift. When he opened them again, there was something fierce and bright in them that had not been there before. They heard me, he said softly. Above, the coalition fleet began scrambling into combat posture, but confusion slowed them. Their doctrine was built for pirates, rebels, and formal navies, not for a rising tide of civilian captains who came from everywhere and obeyed no central order. Some of the first arrivals rushed the flanks, not to destroy warships but to break formation. Tankers dumped sensor chaff clouds. Salvage tugs released drone swarms that confused targeting. Couriers streaked through gaps, forcing interceptors to scatter. Mining vessels fired industrial cutters hot enough to burn through armor seams. Survey ships jammed range locks with terrain ghosts and false gravity echoes. Old patrol craft shielded softer hulls. Heavy freighters like Nari's moved into broad defensive walls, using their massive bulk to block firing lanes while smaller ships slipped behind them. Bora's voice cut across the captain band like iron. All ships, listen. We are not here to win a war. We break the blockade, protect the colony, and make them retreat. Hit their coordination. Hit their confidence. Stay moving. Hannah laughed sharply over comms. That almost sounded like a plan. For you, Bora replied. The plan is don't be stupid. Too late. Then the stars erupted. The first real clash hit like thunder in vacuum. Bright lines of weapons fire, flaring shields, tumbling debris, emergency burns, shouted warnings, and the mad, impossible fury of hundreds of independent ships fighting not for pay, not for territory, but because one human once chose to care about them when he had no reason to. From the surface, the sky above Haven 47 became a storm of light. Children in deep shelters stared at ceiling monitors showing streaks of fire crossing the dark. Adults who had prepared to die stood in stunned silence as unknown civilian transponders filled orbit like a second dawn. Jean watched the battle unfold through the tactical display and felt a pressure in his chest so strong it almost hurt. Years ago, alone in a freezing shuttle, he had asked a half-joking promise of 4 strangers because hope was all he had left. He had never expected this. He had never expected the galaxy itself to answer. But it had. And as more jump signatures continued appearing beyond the outer veil, as ship after ship joined the growing wall between Haven 47 and the fleet that came to claim it, one truth became impossible to deny. The coalition had arrived expecting an easy conquest, and instead they had awakened every captain who had ever owed a debt to a human named Jean. The battle above Haven 47 did not look like the clean, perfect formations shown in military records, and that was exactly why the coalition fleet began losing control. Commander Reth stood on the bridge of the Dominion Spear with growing disbelief as the tactical display turned from a simple blockade map into a chaotic storm of civilian transponders, broken attack lines, and failing command routes. He had expected frightened settlers, weak defenses, and maybe a few desperate smugglers. Instead, he was facing something far more dangerous. Thousands of independent captains who did not fight like soldiers because they were not soldiers at all. They fought like miners protecting their homes, couriers who knew impossible routes, salvage crews who understood broken hulls better than engineers, smugglers who lived in blind spots, and freight captains who had spent years surviving places where official fleets rarely went. Bora's Blue Lantern led one of the hardest pushes through the center of the blockade. Its scarred hull shaking as Day pushed the engines beyond every safe limit he had ever written in his own manuals. "Port shields are down to 42, Day shouted from engineering. "Then give me 41, Bora replied without looking back, her eyes fixed on the gap opening between two coalition escorts. "I only need one pass." Beside her, the tactical board flashed with calls from other ships. Hannah's Swift Echo was already moving like a silver knife through the chaos, darting between heavier vessels, drawing interceptor wings away from the main civilian line, then doubling back to cut across their flanks. Sora fed her blind angles and weak points so fast it felt like they were sharing one mind. "3 drones behind us," he warned. "Not for long," Hannah snapped, rolling hard under a burst of plasma fire before cutting across the nose of a larger escort. The escort tried to turn, but it was too slow. A mining rig under Captain Jisu, its industrial lasers never meant for war, fired a brutal beam straight into the escort's shield seam. The shield flashed white, collapsed, and the ship spun off smoking. "That one was mine," Hannah said over comms. Jisu laughed. "You're welcome." Around them, the strange fleet of captains turned chaos into a weapon. Tanker ships dumped clouds of fuel vapor and reflective chaff that confused enemy targeting. Survey vessels used terrain ghost data from Yuri to create false sensor echoes, making coalition gunners fire at empty space or waste time avoiding phantom debris fields. Mina's repair barge stayed behind the front line, releasing swarms of patch drones that clung to damaged civilian hulls, sealing breaches just long enough to keep them in the fight. Somi's medical transport held back near the edge of orbit, its bays already filling with wounded pulled from burning ships by tug crews and rescue shuttles. Nari's Morning Veil became a moving wall, her freighters massive bulk shielding smaller craft while Hyun's heavy haulers launched armored cargo pods toward Haven 47 surface, each one packed with batteries, medical kits, emergency food, and spare shield components. On the colony below, the sky looked alive. Children in underground shelters watched screens showing streaks of fire and shouted each time another friendly signal appeared. Adults who had spent 2 days preparing for occupation or death now stood shoulder to shoulder in command tunnels, repair shafts, and defense posts, staring upward with tears in their eyes as the impossible continued to unfold. In the control hub, Mira could barely keep up with the flood of incoming data. "Portable reactors from Mina's barge just landed in Sector 2, she shouted. "Hyun's pods are reaching the eastern trench line." June looked at the tactical display and almost laughed in disbelief. "Our shield grid is rising. We're actually getting stronger." Tae, who had been trembling with fear hours earlier, now had both hands flying across the comm board, routing voices from orbit to ground teams. "Captain Era is sending reserve fuel to the north batteries. Yuri says there's a safe corridor opening above Ridge 4. Somi wants med-evac priorities. Bora is asking if we can fire the mining array in 12 seconds. Jean stood at the center of it all, listening, moving, deciding. He no longer looked like a man trying to delay defeat. He looked like someone who had been handed a second chance and intended to use every second of it. "Tell Bora yes," he said. "Tell June to wait until Hannah clears the corridor. Mira, route Mina's reactors straight into shield support, not weapons. Keep civilians safe first." Mira stared at him for half a heartbeat, then nodded hard and ran. Jean keyed the colony-wide channel again, but this time his voice carried something different, something bright and fierce that spread through every shelter and tunnel. "All defense teams, this is Jean. Friendly ships are in orbit. We are not alone anymore. Hold your positions. Hit only marked targets. Today, we do not give them this world. The response from the colony came not as words at first, but as movement. Engineers ran faster. Gunners steadied their hands. Wounded volunteers returned to support posts if they could still stand. Fear did not vanish, but it changed shape. It became anger. It became courage. It became the stubborn human refusal to kneel when someone stronger said kneel. In orbit, Bora's blue lantern punched through the heart of the blockade at the exact moment Hannah screamed across the open band, "Corridor clear!" June slammed his fist down on the fire control in the colony hub, and the old mining array hidden beneath Haven 47's eastern ridge woke like a buried giant. Once, long ago, it had been built to crack deep ore veins. Now it turned toward the sky. A blinding spear of industrial energy tore upward through the atmosphere and slammed into the belly of a coalition assault carrier that had been preparing its main drop wave. The carrier's shields, already weakened by crossfire and confusion, burst apart in a ring of white fire. The beam carved through armor, engines, and internal launch decks all at once. For a breathless second, the giant ship simply hung there, glowing from within. Then it split open. Burning dropships spilled from its wound like sparks from a broken furnace, and the carrier began to fall out of formation. Across every captain band, cheers erupted. "That's for the colony," Jisoo shouted. "That's for making us hurry," Hannah added. Even Day barked a laugh from engineering, though he immediately followed it with, "If anyone tells the ship I enjoyed that, I'll deny it." Commander Reth's control began to collapse after that. His officers shouted over one another as more civilian ships arrived, as damaged escorts failed to reform, as the assault carrier drifted burning across the tactical map, and as the colony below, which should have been dying, instead surged back to life under fresh power and supply drops. "Reinforce the central line," he ordered. "Destroy the civilian vessels if they block the approach." But his fleet had already lost the advantage that mattered most: certainty. Coalition crews were trained to dominate weaker opponents. They were not trained for a battlefield where civilian cargo haulers rammed drone swarms to protect medical ships, where salvage tugs latched onto disabled escorts and dragged them out of formation, where smugglers flew through engine wash to plant improvised mines, and where every time one captain fell back another two took their place. Worse, the open captain bands carried a constant flood of voices that the coalition could not fully jam. Shielding Blue Lantern's starboard side. Fuel transfer to Iron Bell complete. Swift Echo, you've got 3 on your tail. Copy. Flipping under. Somi needs evac route. Morning Vale opening lane now. It was messy, loud, and completely alive. No single admiral commanded it. No doctrine controlled it. It adapted every second because it was built from people who had survived by adapting their whole lives. Jean finally left the colony hub when the first landing attempt on the eastern ridge turned serious. Coalition dropships, desperate to secure any ground foothold, pushed through the defensive fire and came in low over the broken shield arc. June moved to go with the ridge teams, but Jean stopped him. "You stay here," he said. "You're the only one who can coordinate this mess." "And you?" June asked. Jean checked the charge on an old pulse rifle someone had shoved into his hands. "I'm going where the line is weakest." Senna grabbed his arm as he turned. "You already stayed when you could have left. Don't make me drag you back from something stupid." Jean gave her a tired smile. "You won't have to." He ran through smoke-filled corridors, past volunteers carrying ammo packs and med crates, up through a lift shaft that no longer had power, and out onto the eastern defense ridge where wind screamed across black rock and burning debris fell from the sky like metal rain. The ridge team was a mix of settlers, miners, mechanics, and 2 off-duty shuttle pilots who had never planned to fight anyone in their lives. Mira was already there, kneeling beside an overloaded shield junction box, sparks flying around her face. "You should be in the hub," she shouted. "You should be in a safe room." Jean shouted back, then saw the first dropship break through the clouds. "Guess we both made bad choices." The dropship came in hard, side guns firing. Ridge cannons answered. One cannon exploded. Another jammed. Jean and the others dropped behind rock and steel as fire ripped the ground apart. Then a shadow screamed overhead at impossible speed. Hannah's swift echo flashed low over the ridge, so close that dust blasted across the defenders, and unleashed a burst straight into the dropship's flank. The enemy craft lurched sideways, slammed into a cliff face, and broke apart in a fireball. Hannah's voice crackled over local comms. "You're welcome again, human." Jean almost laughed despite the chaos. "You really like dramatic entrances. Learned from you." More dropships tried to descend, but now the orbit above them was turning against the coalition. Bora's coordinated strikes had broken their central command spacing. Nari's freighter group had sealed off a retreat lane with sheer mass. Jisoo and Un were hammering at escort screens. Era's tankers had resupplied ships that should have been dead in the water. Yuri's false sensor ghosts caused 2 coalition frigates to nearly collide while chasing targets that did not exist. Mina's drones kept broken ships alive. Somi's crews kept broken people alive. And all across the system, new civilian signatures still arrived, as if the galaxy had decided there was no such thing as too much help for one human who had spent years helping everyone else. On the Dominion Spear, Reth finally faced the truth. His fleet was bloodied, disordered, and now dangerously exposed. If he stayed, the battle would shift from failed occupation to humiliating disaster. He clenched his jaw so hard it hurt. "Signal retreat formation," he said at last, each word heavy with fury. "Pull back to outer range. Recover what we can." One of his officers stared. "Sir, the colony is no longer worth the loss." The order went out. At first the coalition ships withdrew in pieces, then in growing waves. Some limped, some burned, some fled faster than discipline allowed. The civilian captains did not chase far. Bora's voice cut sharply across the band. "Do not overextend. We protect the colony. Let them run." There were complaints, especially from the rougher captains, but they obeyed because she was right. This had never been about revenge. It had been about saving Haven 47. As the last major enemy ships turned away from the planet, a silence slowly spread through the system, broken only by rescue calls, repair requests, and the crackle of damaged comms. Then, one by one, the cheers began. On the surface, the Ridge defenders shouted and cried and collapsed into each other's arms. In the colony shelters, children screamed with joy as the hostile markers vanished from the sky. In orbit, tired captains laughed, cursed, cried, or simply sat in stunned quiet as the reality settled over them. They had done it. They had faced a war fleet with freighters, tugs, couriers, mining lasers, stubbornness, and shared debt, and they had won. Jean stood on the eastern ridge, chest rising hard, face lit by the fading glow of battle in the upper atmosphere. Around him, black stone and broken steel steamed in the cold wind. Above him, the sky was filled not with enemy warships anymore, but with friendly civilian lights, hundreds, then thousands, scattered across orbit like a second starfield. Bora's voice came through his comm first, rough but steady. "You still alive?" Jean looked up, and for the first time in 2 days, he allowed himself to breathe like a man who expected tomorrow to exist. "Barely." Hannah cut in immediately. "Unacceptable. We came all this way and you're only barely alive." Nari's warm, tired voice followed. "He can explain after he thanks us properly." Laughter spread across the channel. Even Day spoke up. "If he starts making speeches, I'm muting him." Jean closed his eyes for 1 second, overwhelmed by relief, gratitude, and the strange ache of being seen by so many people at once. When he opened them, his gaze swept across the lights above. The Blue Lantern, the Swift Echo, the Morning Veil, the Red Finch, Iron Bell, North Glass, and hundreds more, names and lives and debts and kindnesses all gathered in one impossible moment. Years ago, stranded and freezing in the Orion Drift, he had made a promise to 4 strangers because he wanted to believe the universe could remember goodness. Then he spent years trying to prove that belief true, one small act at a time, never expecting anything back, never asking for reward. Now the answer surrounded him in the sky. He keyed the open band, and his voice, tired and thick with emotion, carried to every captain still listening. "I don't know how to thank all of you." For a moment the band stayed quiet. Then Bora answered first, her tone softer than most people ever heard. You already did, years ago. Hannah added, you helped one person, then another, then another. Did you really think no one would remember? Nari's voice followed, warm and sure. You were never building favors, Jean. You were building family. That line settled over the system like truth made visible. One by one, more captains opened their channels, and what came back to him was not a single speech, but a wave of simple voices from across the stars. You saved my crew. You saved my daughter. You fixed our station. You brought us medicine. You stayed when others ran. You mattered. Finally, from somewhere in the flood, a voice Jean did not know at all spoke words that many others repeated after, until they became the final sound carried across the rescued world and the orbit above it. You were never alone, human. And standing on the ridge of Haven 47, with the cold wind on his face and a galaxy of answering lights above him, Jean looked up at every captain who had come, every ship that had changed course, every stranger who had become something more, and understood that the smallest act of kindness in the dark had become the strongest fleet he would ever see.